the situation remains difficult in the POKROVSK direction. There, Ukrainian soldiers repelled the highest number of Russian attacks. In this sector of the front, the invaders made 26 unsuccessful attempts to push the defenders from their positions. Another 16 attacks by Russian occupiers were repelled in the Lyman direction.
The advance of Russian troops is at least several weeks behind schedule, even though they had set this deadline for themselves. And, accordingly, the Russians are in a hurry. They're rushing, in order to try, during this summer period, to start urban fighting in some populated areas. Basically, we understand that we're talking about Pokrovsk and also about Kostyudynica. That's what the enemy wants. On the other hand, right now we see aviation. It's a unique case in this war. This fortress is truly impregnable for the enemy.
Also, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in the southern Slobozansky direction, the defense forces repelled 2 enemy attacks near the settlement of Vovchansk. Ukrainian soldiers report that in this section of the front, strike drone pilots destroyed an enemy field ammunition depot, as well as Russian positions and shelters.
Our position.
Our position was literally about 10 meters from the grove where the enemy was. And as soon as we secured ourselves there, we didn't know from which side they would come or how close they could get. They started shooting in our direction. I opened fire with my rifle in the direction where I heard voices. I was literally shooting by ear. I realized they were getting closer and closer. And then the voices went silent. After 5 minutes, I couldn't hear any voices in that direction anymore.
Ukrainian soldiers demonstrated their effectiveness in the Sumy and Zaporizhzhia regions. The special forces of the main intelligence directorate are smashing not only Russian occupiers, but also their equipment, as well as drones, command posts, and enemy positions. In particular, in the city of Tokmat, the crew of the so-called Russian drone operators was destroyed.
The members of the aerial reconnaissance crew specialized in using the SKA-350M UAVs. The Russian invaders used this drone to detect the positions of Ukraine's security and defense forces in the Zaporizhzhia region and to adjust artillery fire. Both Russian operators, along with the UAV, were destroyed. The main intelligence directorate reminds, for every war crime committed against the Ukrainian people, there will be just retribution. From a statement by the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine on Telegram.
In addition, the General Staff reports that 7 Russian attacks were repelled in the Novopavlivka direction, for each in the Toretsk, as well as the North Slobozansky and Kursk sectors. The occupiers also unsuccessfully tried to advance 3 more times in the Siversk direction, twice in the Kramatorsk area, and once near Sinkivka in the Kupiansk sector. Military experts note that the enemy continues to send its soldiers into so-called meat assaults, almost without using any equipment.
And now they're even bringing up what is basically scrap metal, which, they try and are trying to refurbish just so it can at least move on the battlefield. Well, as for what happens to them after that, it's pretty clear too. Today, so-called low-altitude airspace and new warfare technologies, if we're talking about drones, have really created zones, especially for Russian equipment and soldiers, that they simply can't manage to cross in time.
In just one day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 3 Russian tanks, 2 armored combat vehicles, about 50 artillery systems, and 2 air defense systems, as well as eliminated 1,170 Russian soldiers. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has already lost more than 1,037,000 soldiers.
For a detailed discussion on the front, we're joined by Serhiy Brachik of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army.
Hello.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Glory to heroes, glory to Defense Forces. Greetings, colleagues.
Let's start, as usual, with a brief overview of the situation at the front. Your observations on the changes in tactics of the Russian occupiers and on the resistance of Ukraine's defense forces to Russian aggression.
Well, actually, we're saying that the enemy's tactics today haven't changed, although the assault groups that are being formed are as large as possible, and they're being sent directly to Ukrainian positions in certain areas. the intensity of combat operations is shifting or has already shifted into a phase of round-the-clock attacks. We're talking about the hottest spots on the front. This is, of course, the POKROVSK direction, where the occupiers are trying to finally establish those footholds for flanking strikes, with which they plan to attack our POKROVSK defensive area. It's obvious that today they're even trying to repeat, though unsuccessfully, frontal assaults in order to intensify those infantry waves I mentioned. The mechanized component is practically not being used by the enemy today, not only because they don't want to, but also because they can't. It's clear that the Russians are currently having problems with military equipment. It's obvious that the Russian defense industry today can't keep up with the orders to replace the losses they've suffered in battles with our defense forces. Moreover, there is information coming in that those storage bases, which have already been so depleted that in fact there's practically nothing left on many of them, are now even raising almost scrap metal, which they are trying and attempting to refurbish so that at least it can move on the battlefield. Well, as for what happens to them after that, it's also obvious that today, so-called low-altitude airspace and new warfare technologies, if we're talking about drones, have really created those kill zones, primarily for Russian equipment and Russian soldiers, who simply don't have time to cross such lines of defense accordingly. That's why, I repeat, the enemy is trying to make maximum use of the Russian infantry component in these battles, because, just like aviation, these are the two elements today that help the Russians advance in certain directions. It's obvious that this tactic will continue. And if we talk about, for example, the North Slobozansky direction of the front, that's the Sumy region, it's clear that the enemy's blitzkrieg didn't work out. Today, we're saying that the Russians are still trying to maintain the intensity of combat operations that existed, let's say, a few weeks ago. It's not really working out for them. Moreover, here the Ukrainian defense forces managed to employ, well, what I would call surgical, scalpel-like methods. These are counterattacks in certain areas, in some locations in the Sumy region. And, in fact, this has produced results. First of all, the enemy was stopped. Secondly, some positions were regained, as well as some settlements that, unfortunately, had been lost during these massive enemy attacks. Today, considering that even on the battlefield in the POKROVSK direction, which is very intense, as well as in the active Lyman-Kupiansk direction, and we also see increased activity in the Pridniprovsk and Zaporizhia directions, the enemy, in my opinion, is not managing to achieve the timelines they had set for themselves. Because, at the very least, the advance of Russian troops is several weeks behind schedule, not meeting the deadlines they had set for themselves. And, accordingly, the Russian forces are in a significant hurry, rapidly rushing to actively try to initiate urban combat operations in some of the populated areas during this current summer period. Essentially, we understand that this is about POKROVSK, and also about Kostiantynivka. This is the enemy's intention. On the other hand, we see Chasiv Yar a unique case in this war, because even by all current defensive indicators, Chasiv Yar's resistance to the enemy has probably surpassed the well-known benchmarks set by our heroic Bakhmut, which, unfortunately, the enemy still managed to take after its complete destruction. So, as of today, Chasiv Yar has already shown that this fortress is truly impregnable for the enemy. But the enemy's activity will continue, if we're talking about the near future, and the intensity of fighting in the main directions is unlikely to decrease.
Serhiy, I'd also like to clarify something. Even foreign media and military analysts are summing up this week and saying that the enemy, let's say, is capturing fewer square meters of territory. This doesn't affect the intensity, but considering their previous activity and now, can we say that they're slowing down, running out of steam, or getting tired? So, what can we say about this past week overall?
Well, actually, that's what we're all hoping for, that the defense forces will manage to wear the enemy down so that they at least slow down a little, because unfortunately, we're still seeing tactical advances on some parts of the front, and even though they're small, they're steady. So, unfortunately, these advances are still happening. Again, we're talking about how much in terms of resources and reserves the Russians are currently prepared to keep acting so aggressively to intensify the fighting along the line of contact. Basically, the Russians are trying to attack along the entire front today. For example, there were no assault operations in the Huliapol direction for 2 days, but everywhere else assault actions are taking place everywhere. Aviation is involved everywhere, although even in Huliapol, aviation is also being used. Here, it's clear that the enemy can rotate their assault groups and bring something closer to the front line. We can see that there has also been a certain increase in activity on the Zaporizhia front. So again, it's about the enemy's resources and reserves. That is one of the main tasks for the defense forces today as well. The first is to preserve the personnel as much as possible and to make maximum use of technology. Of course, first and foremost, we're talking about drones in order to prevent the enemy from advancing and, accordingly, to once again reach the level of Russian military losses that the defense forces were demonstrating just a few weeks or months ago. And today it's obvious that although the Russians are attacking, these small groups are not yet turning into columns, unfortunately for us, because those would be very good, lucrative targets. That's why the enemy is also trying as much as possible to avoid losses, so that they can make up for them with those mobilized soldiers and contract servicemen they bring into the so-called special military operation, essentially to cover those losses. That's why our task today is obviously to work more actively against the enemy's rear. This refers to our aviation, of course. And of course, it's also about our long-range strike capabilities. And here, of course, what would be really useful for us on the battlefield today are long-range guns and missiles, including ballistic ones, which could strike deep into Russian territory, for example, at Russian training centers, military ranges, and so on and so forth. So it's obvious that the Russians are also trying to avoid heavy losses today.
Now, regarding what else the Russians are using. They are increasingly using chemical weapons in the war against Ukraine. This is something the European Union is drawing attention to. According to Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian Federation has used chemical weapons on Ukrainian territory at least 9,000 times. Let's listen and discuss. Russia's bombing campaign has.
Russian bombings have reached record levels, and we are seeing an increase in Russia's use of banned chemical weapons in Ukraine. According to German and Dutch intelligence, the use of such weapons is only increasing, which is causing serious concern among Western leaders. All of this shows that Russia does not want peace. And in response, the EU is ready to approve one of the toughest sanctions packages against Russia.
How do we fight this? And in your view, does the enemy still have a lot of these chemical weapons? And in which particular areas are they being used the most? And how do we counter this? How can we prevent it?
In fact, the enemy has demonstrated the use of chemical weapons on probably every section of the front. Today, I honestly find it hard to name a place where they haven't used it. The only difference is probably the number of times it's been used. Really, it's no longer, well, let's put it this way, it's neither a secret nor something hidden, and it's already being talked about openly and a lot, that the enemy is using chemical weapons. Again, if we talk about the use of various types of prohibited weapons, it's obvious that the Russians start using them when they don't see, let's say, any prospects of advancing in a given direction through traditional military methods, manpower, the number of troops, or, accordingly, the use of equipment or airstrikes. That is, they've long since switched, including to the use of chemical weapons. Actually, the sanctions our European allies talk about, yes, and especially the enforcement of these sanctions, not just discussing that there will be tough sanctions tomorrow, but quietly doing their job, imposing sanctions, monitoring them, as I already mentioned. And again, we're saying that our strikes on Russian territory should become more painful for Russians, including, for example, if we're talking about targets in the military-industrial complex. As for chemical weapons themselves, we know that Russia, which has declared itself the successor of the Soviet Union never shied away from using chemical weapons or preparing chemical weapons for warfare. That's why there are quite a lot of these stockpiles in Russia. The only thing I can wish for Russians in this regard, and these wishes really do come up, considering the conditions in which chemical weapons are stored on the territory of the Russian Federation, is that I sincerely hope that their own hour of reckoning will come as well. Well, accordingly, we also have our own specific conclusions regarding the use of chemical weapons. This is about protecting our personnel. That's what we keep talking about all the time. And again, there will be strikes against those capabilities of the Russian Federation that it demonstrates and tries to demonstrate on the battlefield. Well, we have some methods today that will be allowed, permitted. This is the mass use of anti-personnel mines. Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada has finally voted to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention. Yes, there are still some technical formalities here, but again, as a word of advice for the Russians, since you brought up this topic, they should get their hands and feet ready.
Serhiy, for the conclusion. There's a lot of talk right now about Trump's statements regarding the transfer of certain weapons or missiles to Ukraine. We won't discuss right now what is planned to be transferred or not, but my question to you as a military expert, what does Ukraine need right now to counter the mass raids of Russian occupiers in various directions? What is needed first and foremost, considering the modern nature of warfare?
Well, of course, we're talking about air defense systems. This is what protects and will continue to protect our critical infrastructure, strengthening our air defense, not just in our regions, but beyond. That's the first thing. The second is to ensure that we don't experience a shortage of artillery shells of the appropriate caliber. I didn't mention anti-personnel lines for nothing, because, for example, the United States has plenty of them, especially those for remote mining. This is what will allow us to stop Russian infantry. And of course, certain types of offensive weapons, primarily we're talking about missiles, including long-range ones, which can and will strike Russian resources, military resources, that won't be able to reach the front line, which, naturally, will affect the course of hostilities.
Sergei, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on air.
Thank you. Have a cheerful day.
Thank you. Same to you. We'll be glad to have you on Freedom again, Serhiy Bratchet.